There are houses that stand, and houses that wait to be remembered, and this might be the creepiest unsolved mystery history ever left behind. In the summer of 1843, a surveyor passed through the hills east of Wren's Hollow and returned with a tale that would haunt local whispers for generations. Speaking of a black house risen from nowhere, a shape clawed into the tree line like a wound refusing to heal, its 3 stories looming, slate roof gleaming dark as oil, painted black as pitch, a sight no record claimed existed the year prior, nor any road led toward, as though the earth itself tried to deny its presence. Yet there it stood above a neglected orchard whose trees leaned away, as if unwilling to touch the house's shadow. Porch sagging gently in the heat, chimney breathing faint curls of smoke, and a row of linens drying on a line, though no mortal hand could be seen. The entire structure pressing upon the air with a stillness thick as velvet, summoning the kind of fear that grows not from violence, but from the certainty that someone or something was waiting behind those shuttered windows, watching in silence. Crafting a secret history in the dark, a scene fit for any dark true story or historical horror documentary that seeks to unravel mysteries best left undisturbed. And when the surveyor called out, no voice answered. Yet when he turned his back to descend, a melody floated faintly from the house. The slow, deliberate pluck of harp strings echoing from unseen fingers. A sound too delicate to belong in the woods. A note woven from salt and old wood and the soft weeping of unseen rooms. And he would later tell the county clerk that it was as if the house did not want to be remembered but could not help being seen, searing itself into the fold of the land. Daring any who dared speak names, you should never speak to step closer. For even then, some deep part of him knew that what he'd glimpsed was not merely a building, but an origin, a presence seated in silence, waiting patiently for the orchard to breathe again, and for history to tilt and make room for the Blackidge House. Some places exist to be forgotten, but this might be the most chilling unsolved mystery history ever tried to bury. In the blistering summer of 1843, beneath a sky so bright it seemed determined to bleach every secret from the hills, a lone surveyor rode east of Wren's Hollow, the heat pressing upon his shoulders, sweat running in careful rivulets along the brim of his hat. When he crested a rise and caught sight of something so improbable it nearly unseated his senses. For there, standing where the orchard once lay untended, rose a house 3 stories tall, walls painted black as pitch, a darkness so absolute it seemed to drink the sun, the slate roof catching the glare like oil slick upon water, a sight so foreign it clawed at the edges of his vision, daring him to look away while demanding that he look closer. A place no map accounted for, no path led to, and yet which seemed, impossibly, to have been waiting for him all along. And he would later recount, in words halting and unsure, that the house seemed not merely built, but placed, dropped whole from some darker memory, as though history itself had split for a moment to allow it through, leaving him trembling on the ridge while a hush fell over the land. The birds gone silent, the cicadas stilled, the breeze refusing to touch the orchard's leaves, as if even the air held its breath, knowing something had changed. And what rose there upon that hill was not just timber and nails, but a wound, or perhaps an eye, opened wide and watching. And as he urged his horse forward, inching closer, he saw details that made no sense, a porch sagging gently under the weight of invisible footsteps, a chimney exhaling faint wisps of smoke that curled backward against the wind, and most chilling of all, a row of linens strung across a washing line, fluttering in the breeze, though there was no woman's silhouette to tend them, no echo of human presence save the slight creak of wood stretching in the heat, each pale sheet catching the sunlight in flashes like blade edges, whispering a rhythm in time with his pounding pulse. And as he tried to understand how a house of such size, such blackness, could have sprouted from the hillside in a single year without stone quarried, timber cut, or paths trampled by cart or boot, he found himself scanning the ground for any sign of passage wheel tracks, hoof prints, a trampled footpath, but saw none. only grass bending gently in the breeze, each blade trembling as though remembering the weight of something that had passed over it unseen. And he called out, his voice cracking like dry twigs beneath a boot heel. The sound swallowed instantly by the dense hush around the orchard, a hush so complete it seemed as though sound itself recoiled from the house's presence. And still, no reply came, though he sensed, with a cold certainty creeping up his spine, that eyes were fixed upon him from the shaded windows, eyes ancient and patient, studying him not as a man but as a note in some unfathomable chord. And when he turned at last, deciding there was nothing more to be gained and perhaps too much to lose, a sound drifted toward him, so faint it might have been wind brushing reeds. But it came in deliberate measures, notes plucked from what could only be a harp, a tune slow, sorrowful, and deliberate, each string resonant with the weight of centuries, the music feeling older than the hills themselves, woven from salt air and sun-bleached wood and the invisible hush of rooms that held secrets far deeper than brick and mortar. And he froze, knowing in a marrow-deep way that he was hearing something not meant for mortal ears, a melody echoing from corners of memory best left locked. And when he finally managed to tear himself away, spurring his horse down the slope, he carried with him not merely fear, but a certainty that the house was not new. Nor had it merely appeared, but that it had always been there, crouched among the orchard trees, hidden behind the folds of reality, waiting for a moment when the world grew thin enough to let it show itself again. And in the days that followed, as he returned to the county clerk to file his maps, he found himself unable to stop describing the house, though each time the telling twisted in his mouth, as if the words tried to slip away before they could take shape. And he confessed, voice trembling like glass on the verge of cracking, that it was as if the house did not want to be remembered, yet could not help being seen, a contradiction that haunted his thoughts, waking and sleeping, until he began to taste salt in his morning coffee, though he never poured any, and smell faint whirls of smoke even in clean air, the scent clinging to his clothes like damp wood left too long in the dark. And the locals who listened, rough-handed farmers and weary merchants and old women with hair bound tight against the summer heat, found themselves leaning in, drawn despite themselves to the idea of a black house rising where no house should stand. And though they told him to hush, to leave such talk be, his story burrowed into Wren's Hollow like a seed dropped into fertile ground, and in taverns and church vestibules, along dirt roads and beneath orchard trees whose fruit refused to ripen, people whispered of a structure black as pitch, the kind of place that might one day anchor a haunted places in history list, or serve as the perfect backdrop for a dark true story whispered into microphones on a late-night horror podcast, or even appear in a haunted history documentary, eager to chase the algorithm's hunger for creepy real stories. For it was the sort of tale that seemed born for a world that thrives on chilling mysteries and cursed places that shouldn't exist. The very definition of a historical horror documentary waiting to be filmed. And yet no matter how many times it was spoken of, no one could say for certain whether the Blackidge House had been built, conjured, or simply remembered into being. And so the orchard waited. The house waited. And the hush around that eastern slope grew thicker, as if the earth itself conspired to keep secrets too dark to be carried in the daylight. And even as the map of Wren's Hollow continued to show nothing but orchard and hill, the memory of black timber and silent windows coiled tighter in the collective mind, daring any who would chase unsolved mysteries and names you should never speak to seek the truth of what stood there. Beneath the summer sun, beneath the layers of history, a place too silent, too black, and far too patient to ever be truly gone. They say there are names you should never speak, and sometimes it's the places that remember them for you, turning history into the darkest true story you'll ever hear. In the pale months following that searing summer of 1843, the hills east of Wren's Hollow carried a hush, like a veil drawn over secrets too ancient to voice. For although the surveyor who first stumbled upon the Blackidge House tried to bury the memory, the tale unraveled itself in whispers carried on orchard breezes, refusing to stay silent, weaving a legend that would one day demand its place among haunted places in history. The kind of chilling real story fit for every dark true story channel or historical horror documentary seeking the next viral unsolved mystery to ignite the algorithm's restless appetite. And it was said that the house, towering 3 stories high, roof glistening black as wet shale, seemed less constructed than conjured, as if some force older than the orchard's oldest roots had pressed it into the skin of the earth overnight. For no foundations had been laid, no stones quarried, no road carved through the thickets leading to its door. And yet it rose above a tangle of neglected fruit trees, whose branches bent away as if recoiling from the house's shadow. The orchard itself, a congregation of wooden limbs, twisted into gestures of fear. And though the house's paint glistened like pitch in the sun, absorbing light until its angles blurred into a silhouette more akin to a memory than a building, it carried mundane signs of life that made its existence even more impossible. A porch sagging gently beneath the weight of invisible feet. A thin coil of smoke trailing from a chimney, whose bricks gleamed slick with condensation even on dry days. And most disturbing of all, a row of linens pinned across a wash line, pale fabric snapping softly in a breeze that smelled faintly of salt and old wood, like ocean air trapped inland where no ocean belonged. And though the surveyor called out, testing his voice against the unnatural silence, no figure came forth. No face appeared at any window. And yet he swore later to the county clerk, voice hoarse with the dryness of fear, that as he turned to leave, the gentlest notes of a harp reached his ears. Delicate strings plucked with such deliberate slowness, it felt as if time itself held its breath to listen. A tune threaded from sorrow and secrecy, each note echoing the hollow hush of rooms unseen. And he confessed that while he stood frozen on the hillside, hair prickling at his nape, it seemed to him that the house was not simply standing there but watching, pressing its presence into the land like a brand upon skin, inscribing itself into memory even as it fought to remain hidden. For though it desired not to be remembered, it could not stop itself from being seen. And the paradox of it gnawed at him in the weeks that followed, creeping into his dreams, where black timber loomed against a sky pale as milk, and a single window high in the 3rd story gaped open just enough for a slip of darkness to spill out, writhing like ink dropped into water. And he began waking in the night, tasting salt on his tongue, the faint scent of damp wood and faded linen lingering in the corners of his small room. And when he attempted to speak of what he'd witnessed, the words tangled themselves, as though even his tongue feared shaping syllables that might summon the house back into sight. And yet the rumor slithered through Wren's Hollow regardless, finding eager ears among those drawn to stories of forbidden places, cursed buildings, and historical horrors that bleed into the present. And it wasn't long before the tale of the Blackidge House became a quiet obsession for those who gathered in church vestibules or stood in the dusty glow of lamplight in taverns. Farmers wiping sweat from their brows, mothers clutching children tighter as if to shield them from invisible eyes, and old men leaning close, lowering their voices to a hush reserved for secrets too heavy to share in daylight. For they began to murmur that no surveyor, no traveler, no hunter had ever spoken of such a house before that summer, and that perhaps it had not been built at all, but rather that it had slipped sideways into their world from a crack between seasons, from a year that had never truly ended, or from a story that refused to stay a story. And they spoke of how the orchard's trees bore no fruit that autumn, how the wind blew salt-scented even though the sea lay miles away, how animals refused to graze beneath the house's shadow, and how birds fell silent the moment their flight passed over the orchard canopy, wings faltering as though the air itself thickened with memory. And as the rumor festered, it became tangled with older fears, fears of land that held memories deeper than its soil, of names that once spoken could not be unsaid, of houses that demanded more than shelter, that required reverence, sacrifice, silence, and that beneath their floors might breathe the remnants of things older than man's first word. For there were whispers that the house was not only a place, but a threshold, a door left ajar for something watching from the other side, a notion that set the orchard trembling in the imagination of Wren's Hollow, until people found themselves glancing eastward in the fading light. uneasy in the hush that now seemed to throb beneath the sound of the crickets. And in every retelling, the house grew blacker, the smoke from its chimney thicker, the linen on the line longer, and the notes of that unseen harp softer yet sharper, slicing into the mind like a blade of glass. And it was then that the first uneasy consensus began to settle among the townsfolk, that this was not merely a building, but a warning folded into the skin of the land itself, an omen waiting for the right moment to open its eyes. And though they tried to bury the talk, muttering prayers and tracing crosses into the dust, the story continued its slow spiral outward, each telling adding new shades of dread, each listener carrying away a sliver of salt and shadow, until it seemed impossible that anything so dark could ever be fully forgotten. For in Wren's Hollow, the Blackidge House became less a structure than a presence, an echo of something vast and patient that watched from between the orchard boughs, daring the curious and the brave to seek its truth. And in the hush that fell each dusk, as the wind grew still and the orchard leaves refused to rustle, it was said that if you listened hard enough, you might hear the faintest whisper of harp strings drifting on air dry as bone, reminding all who dared to wonder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only survived. The perfect dark true story waiting to haunt the edge of every haunted history documentary, ready to become the next creepiest unsolved mystery the world's ever known. What if everything you trust about reality was only true until the day one name, one house, made it unravel, and this could be the darkest true story history tried to erase? In the winter of 1844, beneath skies low and heavy with snow that seemed to press thought itself into silence, a man appeared at the doors of Briar Hollow Parish, calling himself Reverend Elias Blackidge, his arrival a ripple in the calm surface of the town's days. For though strangers passed through often enough, few ever carried themselves with such solemn authority, nor brought objects so strange as the one tucked beneath his arm, a book bound in dark leather so old that the edges frayed like the wings of moths, bearing upon its cover a silver cross twisted into a shape no eye could quite resolve. And though the people of Wren's Hollow were used to preachers who came offering salvation or condemnation in equal measure, they found themselves drawn to Elias Blackidge, not out of devotion but from the cold gravity he seemed to radiate, the way his pale eyes cloudless, pale as watered milk, held theirs without a flicker, as if they were pages he was studying for hidden meaning. And he spoke with a voice that fell soft as dust, yet seemed to vibrate somewhere deeper than hearing. A voice that slipped between words like salt water through cracks in old wood. And he came not with letters of ordination nor witnesses to his ministry. Only the claim that his flock waited east of the orchard, yearning for official recognition as an extension of the congregation. A claim delivered with a serene conviction that made the elders of Briar Hollow Parish shift in their chairs. For though the request was simple, everything about the man suggested complexities not yet spoken. And when he opened his strange book, flipping pages written in a script that twisted and forked like river deltas, he said it was not Latin, nor Greek, nor even Aramaic, but something closer to the tongue of Eden. Words older than sin, older than memory, older perhaps than the orchard itself. And at this, a hush fell across the chamber. For though men of faith were not strangers to the notion of hidden tongues, there was something in the way Blackidge smiled a tight, knowing curl of his lips, as if he'd expected precisely this moment of hesitation. And though the elders tried to question him further, demanding references and proof, he simply closed the book, placed it gently upon the table, and said, "It will be remembered, whether you wish it or not." And in that moment, some claimed later, the lamps guttered, though no wind passed through the room, and shadows seemed to lengthen along the seams of the wooden floor, gathering in corners as if listening. And though the elders refused his request, politely but firmly, they carried home with them the memory of his eyes and that smile that seemed to know the shape of each man's doubts. And in the days that followed, when word was dispatched to Wren's Hollow to inquire after the man and his supposed congregation, no record of him existed, as though his name had been breathed into the snow only to melt away by dawn. And thus began the first contact, the first breach in the ordinary skin of reality. For though his body left no trace, the shape of his presence remained, like an afterimage burned into the town's collective sight. And it would come to pass that some whispered how the orchard's wind began to shift that winter, bringing with it a scent of salt where there ought only to be the dry, crisp smell of frost. And children walking too near the tree line began to murmur of windows that reflected no light, and a woman rocking on a porch with her back to the world, cradling something too small to be a child and too still to be alive. And there was talk that the snow that winter fell in spiral patterns around the orchard's edge, settling into shapes that looked like letters no one could read. And these were the first hairline cracks in reality's smooth surface. Cracks into which Blackidge's name sank like water into thirsty earth. Until there came a boy, Emery Thatch, who vanished for hours beyond the peach groves and returned pale as bone, dried blood caked beneath his fingernails, repeating a single word over and over in a voice too calm to belong to a child downstairs. Downstairs. And though his mother claimed it was sleepwalking and kept him close afterward even during church services, others whispered that something else had spoken through him. For in his eyes lingered a glassy sheen, as if he'd stared too long into something that stared back. And by the time word of Elias Blackidge's appearance reached Wren's Hollow, the man and his supposed followers had been scrubbed from the parish registry as if no pen had ever recorded his name. And thus reality seemed to tremble at its edges, the orchard groaning quietly in the windless nights. And though no roads led toward that eastern rise, no cart tracks marred the snow, a sensation grew among the people, a low, gnawing certainty that somewhere in the orchard, doors existed that no man had built, and that to open them would be to remember things the earth itself was trying desperately to forget. And so began the legend of the Blackidge name, not as a man or a family, but as a fracture running beneath the crust of everyday life, a hairline split through which another world sometimes breathed. And as men gathered in hushed circles, spinning tales of haunted places in history and dark true stories that refused to stay silent, the name Blackidge lodged itself into the roots of Wren's Hollow like a seed waiting to bloom, daring any who chased viral unsolved mysteries and names. You should never speak to step closer and discover whether the orchard beyond the eastern hills was merely a grove of twisted trees, or the threshold to something waiting, ancient and patient, beneath the skin of the world, its voice a distant whisper of salt and harp strings, and the promise that reality was never as whole as it pretended to be. Some truths crawl out from beneath the floorboards, whispering that reality was only pretending to keep us safe, and this might be the most terrifying true story history ever tried to forget. By the time winter clawed its pale fingers across the orchard's limbs in 1844, the hush that hung over Wren's Hollow was already heavy with secrets. For though the Black House itself remained silent on the hill, it sent forth a harbinger in the shape of a man, Reverend Elias Blackidge, whose arrival slipped into the parish like a sliver of ice beneath the skin, unseen at first, but impossible to ignore once felt, and he came unannounced, carrying no letters of introduction, no credentials from any known church, only a presence that seemed to stretch the space around him, as though he pulled invisible threads tighter with each step. And tucked beneath his arm was a book so dark that lamplight refused to rest upon its surface, bound in leather that shimmered faintly as if wet, its silver cross on the cover twisted into lines that made the eye ache, as though looking too long might shift the bones behind your gaze. And when he laid that book upon the elder's table, he said nothing of Scripture as they knew it, but spoke of words older than Genesis, older than Eden, written in a tongue he claimed was closer to the first breath God exhaled than any human sound. A statement that left the elders shifting in their seats, clutching their worn Bibles as though the leather might shield them from something seeping across the floorboards. And though they demanded to know where his congregation gathered, he offered no names, no landmarks, only a gentle smile that carried no warmth and eyes so pale they seemed almost translucent. And one of the elders, a man seasoned by decades of quiet faith, would later confess that when he looked into Blackidge's face, he felt as though he were standing at the edge of a stairwell spiraling downward into black water, unsure whether he was about to fall or had already begun. And so the elders refused him, politely but firmly. Yet as they ushered him out beneath the hush of snow falling in the churchyard, they could not shake the certainty that something vast had brushed against the edge of their world, as though Elias Blackidge were less a man than a seam torn open between one reality and another. And in the weeks that followed, as townsfolk began speaking his name in uneasy half-whispers, they discovered that no mention of him could be found in any parish record, no birth certificate, no baptismal date, nothing to prove he had ever existed at all, and that absence began to gnaw at the town's certainty, like a worm tunneling through ripe fruit, for it suggested that either he had never been or that he had always been there, waiting beneath the orchard's roots, biding his time until the right season came to bloom, and that uncertainty infected the orchard itself. For children wandering too close began to speak of windows that swallowed light rather than reflected it, and of a woman who rocked back and forth on the Black House's porch, her back turned to the world, cradling something too small and too still to be a child. And there was one boy, Emery Thatch, who disappeared beyond the peach groves for hours and returned as the sun fell low, pale and shaking, dried blood crusted beneath his fingernails. And though his mother claimed he'd been sleepwalking, the boy sat beside the fire that night, repeating a single word in a voice flat as stone downstairs. Downstairs. Until it seemed the syllables themselves might crawl free of his mouth. And though the elders tried to attribute it all to winter fevers or the overactive fancies of youth, something had shifted in the orchard's hush, for there came stories of winds blowing salt-heavy across the snowdrifts, of spiral patterns forming in the frost where no foot had passed. And though the people tried to carry on with prayers and plowing and the slow work of winter survival, they found themselves pausing at the edge of the eastern rise, listening for faint strains of harp music drifting between the skeletal branches. And there were those who swore they saw movement high in the third-story window, a flutter of shadow, a tilt of unseen eyes, as though the house itself were testing the seams of reality, searching for the place where dreams and memory began to blur. And in those moments, it felt to many as if Wren's Hollow perched upon a ledge far narrower than they'd ever known. A ledge separating the ordinary world from a darkness that could swallow it whole. And so the name Blackidge began to circulate like a secret disease, infecting conversations in the tavern and quiet prayers in the church, until people could not decide whether it was safer to speak it or to let silence devour it, for they knew that some names, once uttered, refused to be forgotten, and beneath that fragile veneer of normalcy, the orchard seemed to breathe deeper each night, the wind no longer merely air but carrying a texture like fabric, as though it were trying to wrap the town in something that whispered, "You were never meant to know this world was only one layer of many." And as the rumors deepened, weaving themselves into a tapestry of dark true story threads, perfect for any historical horror documentary or unsolved mystery channel eager for viral views, it became impossible to dismiss the sense that Wren's Hollow had crossed a threshold, that reality itself now bore a hairline fracture through which salt air, harp strings, and the pale eyes of Elias Blackidge continued to look back, patient as stone, waiting for the orchard to remember the rest. It's one thing to fear the unknown, but it's another to realize the unknown already knows you, and this could be the most dangerous true story no history book ever dared record. By the turning of 1847, the hush in Wren's Hollow had thickened into a silence so heavy that sound itself seemed reluctant to echo, and though the townsfolk tried to pretend life moved on as usual, there grew an undercurrent of brittle fear, for something unseen had begun to press against the seams of reality. And it was Reverend Silas Dorr of Briar Hollow who first dared write it down, filling his parish journal with entries that scratched across the page like warnings scrawled by a hand trembling under some unseen weight. And he noted how church attendance dwindled week by week, particularly among families whose homes nestled closest to the eastern woods, those once verdant paths now swallowed in a hush so deep it seemed to press like water against the ears. And though the excuses varied illness, flood, unseasonable frost, their eyes carried the same look. A glint of panic shuddered quickly behind polite nods. And when Silas decided to make pastoral visits, hoping to push back whatever dread had seeped into the hills, he found himself stepping into houses that felt like traps set for memory, places that held the warmth of recent life, yet stood as hollow as mausoleums. One house with stew still steaming upon the table, a cradle rocking gently though no child could be found. Another home where every mirror had been turned to face the walls as if even glass might betray secrets best unseen. And a third house, where verses of scripture had been carved deep into every wooden beam. The lines gouged so raw they wept splinters, as if ink had ceased to suffice against whatever stalked unseen between walls. And Silas returned from these journeys changed, eyes sunken, voice clipped, carrying the certainty that what plagued the town was no fever of the flesh, but a blight of spirit. Something coiling through the orchard roots, whispering its way into timber and bone, and he sent pleas for assistance to the presbytery, but no one came. No letters were answered, as if the mere mention of Wren's Hollow had become a weight others refused to carry. And the following month, Silas stepped up to the pulpit to deliver his last sermon to an empty chapel, his voice echoing off stone until it dropped into a whisper so soft the few who lingered at the doors could barely hear him say, "He is beneath us now." And from that day forward, he never preached again. A man broken by the knowledge that the orchard was no longer just trees, but a kind of sentient boundary, an edge between the world as it should be and the world as it truly was. And as winter clawed at the hills, people began speaking less and watching more. The town bell that once rang out for births and deaths fell silent. Dogs refused to cross the orchard's edge after dusk, their bodies trembling as if some ancient instinct screamed that what waited beyond those trees was not merely danger, but something capable of unraveling the soul itself. And there were reports of lights flickering pale blue atop the hill, soft as candle flames yet pulsing in a rhythm like a hidden heartbeat. And voices drifting on the wind in a broken cadence, not quite song, not quite speech, but somewhere in between, like prayers mumbled through a veil of salt. And the orchard began changing in ways no living thing should. For paths that once curved safely through thickets now ended in walls of bramble so dense they might have been grown overnight. And the air took on a weight that pressed into lungs, carrying the taste of iron and distant oceans, though the nearest salt water lay miles away. And so it was that the townsfolk began to withdraw into themselves, each household an island, the distance between neighbors suddenly as wide as seas. For even glancing eastward seemed to invite attention from whatever watched through the orchard's skeletal branches. And they whispered of how the trees leaned subtly toward the house, as if drawn by a breath none could hear, and how the orchard gates, once standing open to the wind, were sometimes found closed tight at dawn, despite no hand having touched them. And there were those who claimed that the orchard itself had begun to hum, not with the rustle of leaves or creatures, but with a sound that rose and fell like the tide, as if the entire grove had become one vast lung breathing in secrets and exhaling dread. And in this rising tide of fear, there came small moments of terror sharp enough to split the mind, like the day a traveling peddler staggered into town pale as death, claiming he had walked the orchard's perimeter and found thin lines of salt circling the base of each tree like crude halos. And when he followed those rings to the hill's base, he glimpsed the house standing silent as ever, but now surrounded by dozens of scarecrows, though he insisted with shaking hands that they were no longer made of straw, for their clothing hung damp, and their skin clung tight to bone, and he swore that as he turned to flee, one of them blinked, and he felt the orchard gates slam shut behind him though there had been no wind. And the more the townsfolk tried to deny these tales, the more the orchard seemed to press itself into their thoughts, until even the shape of daily life felt fragile, as though the real world were nothing more than a thin veneer stretched tight over something ancient, waiting, and very, very hungry. And though no one spoke it aloud, The truth bloomed like rot in every mind that whatever had planted itself in the orchard's soil was no longer content to stay hidden, and that the Blackidge House was not simply a house, but a signal, calling out across years, across bloodlines, demanding to be remembered and ready to pull all who dared look too closely into depths from which there was no safe return. You can survive a haunting when it happens to your house, but what if it happens to your entire town, and there's nowhere left to run? This is the kind of dark true story that even history tried to bury. By the close of 1847, Wren's Hollow had begun to feel less like a village and more like a cage built from silence. For the orchard's influence was no longer content to remain hidden in shadows, but had begun to spread its roots into every room, every prayer, every breath, and it was the townspeople themselves who first carried the infection of dread home from the edges of those twisted trees, returning with eyes sunken, words caught behind teeth, as though each syllable might spill secrets better left unsaid. And while Reverend Silas Dorr tried at first to hold his congregation together with scripture and steadfast faith, he could not deny what he saw with his own eyes when he ventured into the homes nearest the orchard's eastern border. Homes that should have been sanctuaries, now transformed into theaters of quiet terror. One where the hearth lay cold, despite stew left half-eaten on the table. A cradle rocking slowly, though no infant could be found. And another where every mirror had been turned to face the walls, as though even glass could no longer be trusted not to betray what it reflected. And in a third home, verses of scripture had been carved so deeply into the beams that the letters seemed to bleed splinters, as though ink and voice alike had lost their power to keep something ancient at bay. And Silas returned each time more gaunt than before, carrying the conviction that the orchard's corruption was not of flesh but of spirit. And he wrote into his journal lines that grew shakier with each entry, noting how parishioners whispered excuses of fevers, sudden floods, or unseasonable frosts, though none could look him directly in the eye, and how the pathways through the woods had begun to change shape. Routes once trusted now folding back into themselves until travelers emerged lost and trembling, certain they had passed the same twisted tree a dozen times, and each night as the wind curled around the chapel's steeple. Silas believed he could hear the orchard breathing, not the rustling of leaves, but a rhythmic inhalation, as though the trees themselves possessed lungs that drew in fear and exhaled salt. And the day finally came when Silas stood alone at his pulpit, gazing over pews emptied not by plague or famine but by a force less visible, yet far more complete. And in a voice that cracked like ice underfoot, he delivered his final words, "He is beneath us now." And after that sermon, he vanished from public life, locking himself away until he was no longer seen at all, as if the weight of knowing the orchard's secrets had folded him into silence, and in his absence, the town's sense of unity splintered like brittle wood, each house sealing itself off, neighbors no longer greeting one another in the street, children kept indoors even on the mildest days, while the town bell that once sang out for births, deaths, and marriages hung silent. Its iron throat rusted shut, and even the dogs began to refuse the orchard's paths, tails tucked, bodies trembling, eyes darting toward the eastern rise as though they sensed the shape of something lurking just beyond sight. And while most townsfolk tried to dismiss the tales as feverish imaginings, there were those who could not deny what they themselves had glimpsed. Pale lights drifting among the orchard trees at midnight, their glow blue and pulsing like the beat of a hidden heart. And voices carried on wind that never quite seemed to blow, murmuring broken phrases in a cadence no one recognized, half prayer, half lament. And it was around this time that stories began to circulate about the orchard's trees changing form, some bending their trunks toward the black house as though drawn by invisible strings, others splitting open in symmetrical wounds that oozed sap dark as rust, and peddlers passing through reported seeing salt circles traced meticulously around each tree's base, lines too precise for mere superstition, as though marking territory or holding something in place. And one traveler staggered into Wren's Hollow speaking of scarecrows that were not straw and canvas, but draped in clothing that glistened with dampness, skin stretched tight across bone, and he insisted that as he turned to flee the orchard's edge, one figure blinked, and that though there was no wind, he heard the orchard gates slam shut behind him. And from that moment on, no one dared approach the orchard's boundary after dark, for the sense had grown unbearable that it was no longer a mere grove of trees but an entity, a watchful mind pressing at the town's borders. And though some tried to dismiss it all as tales spun for dark true story collectors and haunted history documentary narrators hunting the next viral unsolved mystery, deep in their marrow, every man and woman of Wren's Hollow knew that the orchard's silence was not emptiness but a kind of waiting, that the orchard now knew them, their names, their footfalls, their prayers, and that the Blackidge House, though black and silent atop the hill, was no longer simply a place, it was a signal, a pulse of dark memory drawing all things toward it. And it was becoming clear that whatever had entered Wren's Hollow was no passing curse, but the beginning of a reckoning, a truth determined to remake the world in its image, and the town, once whole, now lay divided by fear, each person alone in a silence that felt alive, as though the orchard were already breathing through their walls, learning how to become part of them. And in that hush, Wren's Hollow stood poised on the brink, held hostage by a presence that seemed less a haunting than a declaration that the world they'd known was over, and the Blackidge House would not remain hidden forever. Sometimes a place doesn't just haunt you, it decides to make you part of its story, and this could be the darkest true story ever hidden from the world. As the final days of 1847 melted into the hard frost of 1848, Wren's Hollow seemed to be held under a glass dome, as though time itself were hesitant to step forward, and in that frozen hush, tales began to leak into town like black ink seeping through linen. Stories of children stumbling out of the woods with wild eyes and salt on their lips, of orchard trees bending toward the house on the hill, as though straining to hear a secret spoken beneath the soil. And one name whispered among them all, Blackidge, a word that felt like ice on the tongue, sharp, cold, and carrying the taste of something older than any map could record. For the orchard had grown restless, reshaping its paths so that hunters who once roamed freely now found themselves turned around in circles, the land folding in on itself until even seasoned men wept with frustration and dread. And there were those who said the air near the orchard had thickened into something almost solid, pressing back against the chest, carrying a tang of iron and the faint perfume of lavender, as though blood and ritual had mingled into a single breath. And it was in this atmosphere of slow, tightening dread that the midwife, Ruth Gantry, found herself roused from her bed by a knock that seemed too quiet to be mortal. And when she opened her door to the hush of midnight, she found a girl standing barefoot in the snow, no older than 16, draped in a linen shift streaked with afterbirth, her eyes wide and unblinking, her skin pale enough to seem almost translucent under the moonlight. And the girl's voice came out like a wind through dry reeds as she said, "He sent me to fetch you." And though Ruth trembled at the words, she felt the familiar weight of duty settle over her shoulders and gathered her tools, following the girl who moved without lantern or hesitation straight into the orchard's twisted boughs, through thickets that should have been impassable in the dark. And as they reached the clearing, the Blackidge House loomed there, seeming smaller than rumor had painted it, its black walls pressed inward as if crushed by an unseen weight, the front door swinging open on silent hinges before Ruth could even raise her hand to knock. And inside, the air was warm, but carried a heaviness like wet cloth, thick with the scent of damp wood and a faint note of salt that burned at the back of the throat, and Ruth delivered the child quickly, a baby girl. Silent, eyes already open, gaze fixed upon a point somewhere over Ruth's shoulder, as though seeing something that hovered in the rafters. And Ruth wrapped the infant in oilcloth and handed her over without a single word exchanged. And she was escorted out again, stepping back into the snow, her breath hitching in her chest as she found a single gold coin tucked into her apron pocket. A coin so bright it seemed to glow, though it bore no mint mark, and grew warm as she held it, and by dawn her hands smelled unmistakably of salt. And as the weeks passed, Ruth told no one what she had seen, But she began waking in the night to the sensation of tiny fingers brushing her cheek, as though the child she delivered had never quite left her care. And the Blackidge House, meanwhile, stood silent and watchful above the orchard. Yet rumors swelled like bruises around it, tales of orchard bark that coiled like muscle beneath the soil, of sap that smelled like rust leaking from the trees nearest the property line, and of bones small, white, arranged in perfect geometric shapes beneath the roots, patterns no animal could have made. And it was Thomas Ela, the young schoolteacher newly arrived from Cincinnati, who tried to map these patterns, sketching the orchard's twisted paths and noting how some trees bent in synchronized curves toward the house, their trunks splitting open in symmetrical wounds that wept amber sap. And he confided to the town constable that he'd found pieces of bone beneath the orchard floor, each one scrubbed clean, laid out in star-shaped formations. And though the constable told him to let the dead stay buried, Ella could not let it go, for he had begun to dream every Thursday without fail of a woman standing waist-deep in a flooded nursery, cradling a velvet-wrapped bundle. And behind her, a staircase descended into black water, steps vanishing into depths so dark they seemed to swallow thought itself. And each time he tried to count the stairs, the woman would speak to him in a brittle, nasal tongue that left his gums aching, a language he could not name but felt lodged deep inside him nonetheless. And the longer he stayed in Wren's Hollow, the more he began to taste salt in his morning coffee, though he added none, to find himself standing silent before his classroom blackboard while his students whispered nervously among themselves. And he once awoke to find dirt beneath his fingernails and dew on his boots, though he remembered no walk. And in his final legible journal entry, he wrote of standing at the foot of the Blackidge orchard in the hour before dawn, the trees around him humming not with wind but with breath, as though the orchard itself had become one living lung, exhaling secrets. And there, upon the porch of the Blackidge House, stood the woman from his dreams, smiling gently as she cradled the velvet bundle. And though he did not remember moving, he found himself closer, close enough to see that behind her. The house's dark doorway yawned like a wound cut into the world, and he blinked, and he was back in his boarding room, the scent of lavender thick in his mouth. And the next day, he resigned from teaching and vanished entirely 3 days later, leaving behind his journal half buried behind the schoolhouse, its pages soaked through with brine. And it was said that in the days that followed, the orchard's edges seemed to draw closer to town, as though the trees themselves were creeping forward inch by inch, pulled by some silent summons, a signal from the Blackidge House that the time had come for the orchard to claim what had always belonged to it. And in that slow, relentless encroachment lay the truth that Wren's Hollow was no longer merely haunted. It was being absorbed, one breath, one memory at a time, into the dark legend of the Blackidge name. What if the only reason reality feels safe is because something monstrous lets it? And this might be the most terrifying true story the world was never meant to remember. By the spring of 1849, the orchard's silence had become a presence of its own, coiling through Wren's Hollow like a living thing. And though people tried to cling to the rituals of ordinary life, Sunday prayers, the ringing of the chapel bell, the slow turning of seasons, there arose the inescapable sense that these small gestures no longer mattered, that the town had slipped sideways into a place where prayer could not reach. And the first crack in that final illusion came when the town's only midwife, Ruth Gantry, was jolted awake past midnight by a knocking so faint it seemed less a sound than a vibration in the air. And when she opened her door, the girl waiting on her step stood barefoot and shivering, linen shift soaked with afterbirth, eyes wide as glass, and spoke in a voice dry as paper. "He sent me to fetch you." And though Ruth felt the surge of terror running hot through her veins, she gathered her tools and followed, moving deeper into the orchard where the trees seemed to bend back like curtains opening to reveal a stage. And what waited at the center was the Blackidge House, smaller than rumor had described it, its black walls caving inward as though pressed by invisible hands. the front door opening before she could even raise her knuckles to knock. And inside, the air was warm but carried a density like breath held too long, saturated with the scent of damp wood and something sharper, a tang of salt that cut at the back of her throat. And Ruth delivered the child quickly, a girl, silent, eyes already open, gaze fixed upon the corners of the ceiling as though tracking movements invisible to human sight. And when Ruth placed the newborn in the girl's trembling arms, neither spoke a word. For the hush in the house was so complete that even breath seemed sacrilegious. And Ruth was escorted out as silently as she'd been let in, returning home just as dawn broke, her apron pocket heavy with a single gold coin without a mint mark, warm as living skin. And though she scrubbed her hands until the flesh peeled, she could not rid herself of the faint, inexplicable scent of salt. And meanwhile, Wren's Hollow found itself beset by phenomena so intricately woven into the fabric of daily life that reality itself began to buckle under the strain. For a new schoolteacher, Thomas Ela, recently arrived from Cincinnati, had begun sketching the orchard's layout in meticulous detail, tracing paths that seemed to twist of their own accord, trees leaning inward as though drawn by some silent hymn. And when he shared his drawings with the constable, pointing out sap that oozed from the trees smelling of rust, and bones arranged beneath the soil in precise geometric patterns, the constable, pale-faced, ordered him to let the dead remain undisturbed. But Ela could not obey, for he had begun to experience the orchard in dreams that felt less like visions and more like memories forcibly returned. Seeing every Thursday without fail a woman standing waist-deep in a nursery flooded with dark water, a velvet-wrapped bundle clutched to her chest, and behind her a staircase descended into blackness, each step seeming to pulse as though alive. And when Ela attempted to count them, the woman would speak in a brittle tongue that twisted inside his skull, leaving him with bleeding gums and a metallic taste of iron on his tongue. And he began finding dirt beneath his fingernails, waking with his boots damp as if from a midnight walk he could not remember. And his students whispered that sometimes Ela would stand before the blackboard, staring through them as if gazing into an endless corridor no one else could see. And though he tried to hold to reason, his journal grew increasingly fragmented, entries blurring into spirals of salt and prayers written backwards, until the final coherent line read, "The orchard breathes, the trees remember, we are standing on its tongue." And 3 days later he vanished entirely, leaving his journal half buried behind the schoolhouse, pages soaked through with brine. And in the weeks that followed, Wren's Hollow felt as though its very boundaries were shrinking. For though no trees physically moved, the orchard's edge seemed closer each dawn, pressing itself against fences, doorways, and dreams. And the town began to fracture, neighbors avoiding each other's eyes, children speaking words no one had taught them. And even the air carried a weight that made lungs strain, as though each breath were being taken from a deeper place. And it was Reverend Greaves, newly sent to replace Silas Dorr, who attempted to restore order by announcing a candlelight service for Candlemas, choosing February 2nd for the ritual. But at the mere mention of the date, an elderly woman wept openly and fled the chapel, whispering, "The orchard doesn't like the light." And though Greaves tried to proceed, insisting faith would be their shield, as the final hymn rose, every candle in the chapel was extinguished at once, though no wind stirred the air. And in the darkness, he followed a trail of salt leading from the pulpit to the narthex, where a single child's shoe sat upright, its small interior crammed with thorns. And though the parishioners fled, Greaves remained, staring at the shadows pooling along the chapel walls, convinced that he could hear a voice murmuring from beneath the floorboards, reciting a liturgy older than any written gospel. And when he returned to his study, he found his hands black with ink, having written the same phrase 77 times. The house will tilt when it remembers the name. And though he tried to carry on, visiting homes in pairs, speaking softly of faith and repentance. The town would no longer let him in, doors closing in his face, eyes looking through him as though he were already a ghost. Until at last, a small girl, barefoot and humming, led him to the orchard's edge and pointed to a cluster of trees gnarled so tightly together they seemed to fuse into one mass of wood, and whispered, "That's where the basement is. They bury the babies in the walls so they can learn the words." And when Greaves asked who had told her that, she simply smiled and said, "My sister. But I'm the only one Mama kept." And though Greaves reported this to the district deacon, no reply ever came. And weeks later he, too, was found alone, scrawling the same words again and again as though possessed. And it was from this moment forward that Wren's Hollow began to unravel. For it became clear that the Blackidge House was not merely a building, but a memory wearing the shape of timber, a wound torn in the surface of the world, and that the orchard itself was a breathing entity, waiting not just to be seen, but to be remembered and to claim all who dared to look too deeply into its shadow. Some secrets don't just haunt history. They bend the rules of reality until you're no longer sure where the story ends and you begin. And this might be the scariest true story history ever tried to erase. By the winter of 1852, Wren's Hollow was no longer a town living beside the orchard, but a town slowly being swallowed by it. For though the trees still stood where they always had, their presence pressed inward with a force that made every wall feel thinner, every doorway an invitation to something waiting just beyond sight. And it was Reverend Josiah Greaves, newly arrived from Barrack Hollow, who stepped into this tightening coil of dread, bringing with him the measured calm of a man devoted to liturgical order and quiet prayer, believing, perhaps naively, that faith alone could anchor a place so obviously adrift. But he was met first with polite silence and then with eyes that refused to meet his, as though each soul in Wren's Hollow were already half turned away from the world. And it was not until he announced a Candlemas service to be held by candlelight on February 2nd that the first true crack in the town's composure appeared, for at the mention of the date, an elderly woman wept openly in the pews, rising with trembling limbs to flee the chapel, leaving behind the faint smell of salt in her wake. And when Greaves asked those who remained what troubled her, he was told only, "The orchard doesn't like the light," a phrase that landed in his chest like a stone. And though his instincts screamed to abandon the plan, he pressed on, determined to restore a sense of holy rhythm to the parish. But as the final hymn rose and candles cast trembling shadows across the wooden beams, every flame died in a single instant, though the air remained still, and in the pitch dark, Greaves stood frozen, his ears straining, until he noticed a thin trail of salt leading from the pulpit to the narthex, where a child's shoe sat upright, stuffed full of thorns, the thorns glistening wet as though weeping blood. And in that moment, something inside him shattered, for he knew with perfect clarity that no sermon, no scripture, no rite he possessed could close what had already been opened in Wren's Hollow. And though he tried to carry on, he found doors closed to him, conversations ending the moment he approached, and it was only a small girl, barefoot and humming, who finally broke the silence, leading him to the orchard's edge and pointing to a knot of trees grown so tightly together they appeared fused, whispering, "That's where the basement is. They bury the babies in the walls so they can learn the words." And when he asked who told her such things, she merely smiled and said, "My sister. But I'm the only one Mama kept." And Greaves reported this chilling confession to the district deacon, but no reply ever came. And weeks later he was found in his study, ink dripping from his fingers, having written the same phrase 77 times. The house will tilt when it remembers the name. And after that, he departed Wren's Hollow for good, leaving the town adrift, shepherdless, and deeply afraid. And it was in this vacuum that new figures emerged, people drawn to the town as if pulled by unseen strings, such as Solomon Breyer, an archivist from the capital, thin as kindling and carrying 3 trunks bound in red cord, who claimed he'd read of Wren's Hollow in a forgotten tract locked away behind the seminary's shelves. A tract stored alongside documents marked problematic scripture and failed resurrections. And though no one could recall inviting him, Solomon rented the old Elah house and began requesting interviews. And at first the town resisted, but he proved gentle, patient, asking questions not as an interrogator, but as a man simply listening. And slowly, stories returned, trickling out from tongues long sealed by fear. Names spoken again. Cora Willett, Reverend Elias Blackidge, the orchard with bowed trees, and as Solomon gathered these tales, he began cross-referencing dates, births, and harvests blighted for reasons no one could explain. And he discovered a pattern so horrifying it left him sleepless. For he realized that across every generation in Wren's Hollow, there was always one missing child, always a girl, always between the ages of 3 and 5, taken without trace, no sign of struggle, no ransom note, no body ever found, only small domestic absences left behind, tiny coats draped over chairs, shoes beneath windowsills, bowls of porridge grown cold on wooden tables, and always afterward, a hymn whispered from the orchard, a sound not quite voice, not quite wind, like breath being pushed through the throat of an ancient pipe organ stuffed with damp leaves. And though no one else had dared connect these disappearances, Solomon did, mapping each event across 40 years until the paths spiraled inward. Not toward the town, nor the chapel, but toward the black house on the hill, the house that had always seemed to belong more to memory than to timber and stone. And on his final day in Wren's Hollow, Solomon walked east, clutching his notes. And though no one tried to stop him, no one watched him leave either, as though the orchard had already claimed him in the eyes of those left behind. And when he failed to return, all that remained was the leather-bound ledger found open on his desk, displaying a family tree with no branches, only a single root plunging downward, and at its base were 2 words written in ink gone slightly blue, still breathing. And from that moment, reality in Wren's Hollow seemed to bend ever so slightly, as though the land itself were tilting. And though the orchard had not moved, fences and roads seemed to shift, and the town became a place where you could leave your home and find yourself turned around, facing trees that should not be there, paths ending in walls of bramble grown overnight. And the people began to whisper that the orchard was not merely alive, but thinking, dreaming them all into a story it would one day finish writing. And in that dawning realization, Wren's Hollow understood that what threatened them was not death, but remembrance. For the Blackidge House did not wish to haunt them. It wished to reclaim them, piece by piece, until all who ever stepped near its shadow became part of its endless memory. And in that revelation lay a terror so deep it unstitched the seams of sanity, leaving the people of Wren's Hollow staring into an abyss that stared right back, humming, and waiting to remember them forever. Some stories end, but some simply keep breathing beneath the surface of the world, and this might be the most haunting true story that refuses to stay buried. By the end of 1858, Wren's Hollow was no longer simply a place, but an echo, a memory folded into the hills and stitched into the orchard's roots. For though the name Blackidge had been scrubbed from every ledger, every deed, every birth record, not crossed out, but simply gone as if it had never belonged to language at all, the land itself could not forget. And the people who had remained in the town found themselves living in a reality so subtly altered they could not trust their own reflections. For animals refused to graze near the orchard, though no fence barred their path. Windows facing east began to crack in perfect spiderweb patterns, as though some unseen pressure pulsed against the glass. And those who had spent more than 2 decades in Wren's Hollow began forgetting names, losing the shape of familiar faces, or wandering from their own doorsteps, certain they stood before strangers' homes. And it was during that long gray December that the final event occurred. One that no single person claimed to witness yet, which every soul in Wren's Hollow seemed to feel like a sudden drop in air pressure. For one morning the orchard fell silent. Not merely quiet, but truly silent. As if every living thing within it held its breath. And into that silence came a sound, not made by any chapel bell, nor any hammer upon iron, but a deep wet tolling like a chime rung from the throat of the earth itself, echoing 3 times, each note dragging like metal pulled across bone. And that day, 13 homes locked their doors, candles lit and trembling upon windowsills. And at the center of town, someone no one knew who left a bundle upon the steps of the chapel. A white baptismal gown folded as if new, untouched by time, and beside it lay a journal wrapped in red cloth, its pages thin as onion skin, inscribed with names and numbers. Strange notations and the shadows of words half formed, and upon the final page, written in a hand tighter and sharper than the rest, were the words, "The house has remembered its shape. The orchard has closed its circle. The mouth is open again." And though no one dared touch the journal after reading that final entry, it was said that the air around it hummed faintly, carrying a whiff of salt and old wood, and in the weeks that followed, the orchard began to bloom in the middle of frost, tiny black flowers opening in rows between the trees, each blossom bearing 5 petals and a single fingerprint pressed into its center, and the townsfolk, already too hollowed out by fear to scream, did not harvest them, did not speak of them, but stood outside their homes, heads bowed, as if hearing some low music just beneath the threshold of human hearing. And though no path had been cut through the orchard, new trails began to emerge on their own, not worn by feet nor cut by blades, but as though something beneath the soil had shifted and risen, shaping the ground into corridors that led nowhere or perhaps led home. And visitors arriving in Wren's Hollow found themselves driving in circles until roads curved back upon themselves. And even those who managed to enter the village found empty fields where a town should have been. For though Wren's Hollow was never erased from maps, those who came looking found only landscapes that seemed to breathe, tree trunks thicker than they should be, roots pushing up through the earth like ribs, and shadows so dense they swallowed the light entirely. And in the hush that fell over the town, there came moments when people swore they could feel a pulse in the ground, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat heard through the soles of their shoes. And it was said that sometimes at dusk, when the orchard stood silhouetted against a fading sky, a single narrow window appeared high upon the hill, a slit of yellow light burning in the darkness, and behind the glass stood a face, unmoving, unblinking, simply watching. And those who dared look too long felt an echo of lavender and salt flood their mouths as if tasting memories that did not belong to them. And it became clear to all who remained that the Blackidge House was not merely a structure, but a living wound in the world. A door left cracked open through which something vast and patient breathed, waiting not to be discovered but to be remembered. And so the orchard remained, its trees twisting ever further downward, leaves bleaching pale as ash, and beneath them the ground sometimes rose and fell with a slow, shallow motion, as if drawing breath. And in that motion lay the truth that the Blackidge name, though erased from paper and speech, still blooms beneath the soil, ripe and utterly awake. And there are those who say that on certain nights, if you listen closely enough, you will hear the orchard singing not in human words, but in a low, droning hum like the vibration of strings drawn tight with sorrow, and that in the space between those notes waits a presence older than stone, older than the first prayer ever whispered beneath the stars. And the townsfolk of Wren's Hollow learned, too late, that there are names we are taught to forget not out of malice, but of necessity, to spare the tongue and protect the dream. Yet the land remembers. It always does. And it threads memory through the roots like breath held in waiting. And though the Blackidge House may never stand again in timber or stone, its shadow has taken form in softer places, in the hush before a thunderstorm, in the moment between blinks when your reflection seems almost to shift, in the taste of salt carried on a breeze miles from any sea. And perhaps that is where all old names go, not into history but into the folds of us. passed down like a fever. A lullaby hummed in a voice we never learned but somehow always knew. And so, if ever you dream of a hill where no house stands yet, feel yourself being watched. If the wind carries no birdsong, and the air thickens with the scent of salt, and if a bundle appears upon your doorstep, still warm, still breathing, do not open it. Let the orchard rest. What if the real curse is never the haunting itself, but the memory that refuses to die? And this might be the scariest true story that's still unfolding beneath our feet. By the time the year 1859 threatened to bleed into the next, Wren's Hollow no longer existed as a place bound by roads or borders, but as a question lodged in the mind, an unresolved chord that hummed beneath the skin. For though the name Blackidge had been erased from every legal document, every map, every parish ledger, not a trace remaining, as if history itself had chosen to forget, the orchard could not be unwritten, and the land itself leaned toward its memory like iron drawn to a hidden magnet. For the trees remained, twisting themselves into grotesque new shapes, branches bending downward as though weighed by invisible chains, leaves paling from green to a color closer to ash than life. And though visitors from distant towns still arrived on occasion seeking the place, rumored in half-spoken legends the haunted place, perfect for a dark true story documentary, or a viral unsolved mystery on a YouTube channel eager for millions of views, what they found instead were roads that curved away, trails that led them back the way they had come, and an air so thick with silence it seemed to press upon the lungs like water. And those who did make it into the hollow found no welcome. For the town by then had grown wary, faces peering from behind curtains, lips sealed shut, as though speech itself might summon something they'd fought so desperately to bury. And though Wren's Hollow was still marked on official maps, those who stepped inside its borders sensed immediately they had entered another layer of reality, one where the orchard's trees seemed not merely alive but watchful, as though each twisted trunk contained an eye turned inward, and the people spoke less and less. For words had become dangerous, names especially, for even the syllables of Blackidge could draw blood, causing noses to bleed, ears to ring, and some claimed even the taste of iron to flood the mouth. And by then, children no longer played past dusk, for the orchard's shadow fell long and cold, carrying with it an invisible pressure that turned laughter into nervous glances and footsteps into a quiet retreat. And though no fresh sightings of the Blackidge House were reported, there were those who insisted that some nights, just as the sky bled into dusk, a single tall window appeared like an eye opening on the hill, a slit of pale yellow light burning against the black silhouette of trees, and behind it, a face would sometimes be seen still, silent, and never blinking, simply watching. And that vision alone was enough to keep even the bravest souls from straying near the orchard's edge. For by then the town knew that the Blackidge House was not merely a place, but a presence, a living wound in the fabric of the world. And though the building itself might be gone, it continued to breathe through the soil, whispering through roots, pressing itself into dreams until even sleep offered no escape. And it was during this final winter that a phenomenon began to spread throughout Wren's Hollow, small but unmistakable patterns appearing in the frost on window panes, delicate filigrees at first, then forming characters no one could read, and soon entire words, letters scrawled backward as if meant to be deciphered only in reflection. And there came a man who left the town altogether after waking to find these symbols burned into the wooden beams above his bed, the marks glistening faintly as if wet with brine, and he was not the only one. For others began finding bundles of salt-soaked linen on their doorsteps, sometimes containing locks of white hair tied with twine, or small stones shaped like tongues, objects that seemed to pulse faintly as if alive. And by spring, the orchard had grown so entangled with the town's borders that even the birds refused to fly above it, their flight lines bending away as though repelled by an invisible wall, and animals found near the orchard were sometimes discovered with their fur slicked damp, eyes wide and rolling, as though they had glimpsed something that could not be contained by mere flesh. And still, the orchard breathed, not as wind-rustling leaves, but with a slow, measured rhythm like an enormous lung expanding beneath the soil. And it was then that rumors began to circulate that a new tree had emerged near the orchard's easternmost border, taller than the rest, its bark black as pitch, its leaves shaped like infant hands curled gently inward, each palm cradling a small stone glistening like a wet tongue. And no one claimed to have planted it. But it was there all the same, rooted and undeniable. And beneath its shadow, the ground sometimes trembled in a subtle pulse that could be felt through the soles of one's boots. And though no name was carved into its trunk, the word return appeared one dawn, neat and precise, etched so deeply into the bark that sap ran in thin lines that smelled unmistakably of salt. And from that moment forward, Wren's Hollow existed in a state of quiet siege, the orchard not advancing any further, yet always pressing close enough to remind every living soul that forgetting was impossible, that memory had a gravity all its own. And though the people no longer dared speak the Blackidge name, they carried its weight in the tension of their shoulders, in the shadows cast across their walls, and in the quiet moments just before dawn when the orchard hummed and the faint scent of lavender and salt crawled beneath every door. And so it was understood at last that the Blackidge House, even unseen, was not merely part of the past, but the very architecture of the Hollow's present. An entity determined to remain remembered, for in Wren's Hollow, the greatest horror was never simply that a house stood black and silent on the hill, but that it still waited, patient and alive, for the day it would be seen again. And in that waiting lay the certainty that some true stories are never truly over, they are simply paused, breathing beneath the world, ready to begin again the moment someone dares to remember. Some legends don't die because they're true. They stay alive because they're waiting to finish what they started. And this might be the most haunting true story you'll ever dare to remember. By the year's end of 1859, Wren's Hollow seemed less like a village and more like a space between worlds. For though the orchard's trees still stood and the chapel still rose from its hill, the town itself felt like it existed under glass, suspended in a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the skull. And even those who stayed began to question whether they were living in a place or simply wandering inside a memory. And though the name Blackidge had vanished from every page and ledger, there were too many gaps left behind, silences where names used to be, like empty chairs pulled away from a table. And it was in these gaps that something seemed to breathe. For the orchard's presence was no longer merely a distant fear, but a constant pressure, humming through the ground like an electric charge just waiting to discharge. And though the roads to Wren's Hollow remained on maps, travelers who ventured there found themselves caught in loops of dirt paths that led them back to the same twisted tree, the same bend in the river, until the sun began to sink and panic turned their footsteps into flight. And those who reached the village found a place so quiet it felt like the inside of a held breath. The houses standing as if listening, and the windows glinting like watchful eyes. And in that hush, stories began to seep outward into surrounding towns. Tales of the orchard blooming black flowers in frost, of trees whose sap ran red as blood, and of the earth itself trembling in slow, measured pulses, as though somewhere beneath the roots lay a heart still beating. And though some dismissed these tales as superstition, perfect fodder for viral dark true story videos or unsolved mystery documentaries seeking millions of views, others felt the weight of them. For there were physical traces left behind, salt trails forming in spiral shapes on wooden floors, fingerprints pressed into window glass high above any human reach, and thin scratches on the underside of floorboards spelling out letters no one dared sound aloud. And it was said that a seamstress hanging lace in her window discovered by dawn that the delicate fabric bore the shape of a face, eyes open and mouth slightly parted as if whispering secrets, and a widower saw, reflected in the glass of his shaving mirror, the pale silhouette of a child standing just behind his shoulder, smiling with a mouth that moved though no words came. And he fled Wren's Hollow, leaving his home to rot under the orchard's spreading shadow. And from then on, the townsfolk began to act like people trapped within a fragile dream, each day moving slower than the last, as though time itself were being stretched thin, and there were those who claimed that in the space between dusk and nightfall, a single window would appear high on the orchard's hill, a narrow vertical slit glowing with sickly light. And behind it, a face watched, unmoving, its eyes dark pools where reflections seemed to swirl as if showing glimpses of forgotten events. And those who dared to look into those eyes sometimes collapsed afterward, speaking in tongues or refusing ever to speak again. And it became whispered knowledge in Wren's Hollow that the Blackidge House, though unseen, had merely shifted downward, blooming into the earth rather than rising above it, its door now hidden beneath the orchard floor, framed in bone-white beams, and sometimes in the coldest mornings, a door-shaped patch of soil would steam as if recently opened. And on one such dawn, a postman following the sound of a child crying found himself standing beneath a tree he'd never seen before, its bark slick with moisture, watching the orchard rise and fall as though drawing breath, and by winter's deepest chill, the only trace of the Blackidge name remaining in the town was a message etched inside the chapel wall. Hidden behind rotting hymnals, 5 words scratched so precisely they seemed engraved by a machine. Though the wall had stood untouched for decades, the fruit has remembered me. And the next morning, the chapel bell rang once and then fell silent forever. And that spring, snow fell only inside the orchard's borders, flurries of salt dusting the ground. And in that hush, Wren's Hollow did not pray, but instead listened. Not because they believed salvation would come, but because something old and buried was already answering. And in the years that followed, Wren's Hollow faded not from maps but from memory itself, the spaces on old charts remaining blank where names should have been. And though some dared to search for it, driven by curiosity or the promise of viral content, they found only forests that seemed to shift and close around them, and shadows that crawled along the forest floor like spilled ink. And so the legend of the Blackidge House became less a story and more a contagion, a knowledge that passed like a fever from one listener to the next, carried in whispered recollections, in the taste of salt on a breeze miles from any sea, in the sudden inexplicable sense that the ground beneath your feet is breathing. And so it was that Wren's Hollow became a place not merely forgotten, but deliberately unremembered, because to recall it fully was to risk becoming part of the orchard's memory. And the truth that remained was this: the Blackidge House was never merely a building, but a wound in the skin of reality, a mouth waiting to reopen. And in that darkness waited a voice that promised not death, but a return. And for those who dare look eastward toward twisted trees and salt-heavy winds, the orchard still whispers, humming softly, reminding the world that some true stories are never finished, they only wait, coiling beneath the surface, until the world is ready to remember them again. So here's the real question. When does a haunting stop being a story and start becoming part of you? In the end, maybe that's the true terror of Wren's Hollow, that it never truly needed walls to contain it, because the story itself became the house. A house that can stand inside your memory, behind your eyelids, humming to itself until you dare to look closer. For all the salt trails, for all the whispered prayers twisted backwards, for all the maps erased and names forgotten, the Blackidge House proves one thing: that the past is not behind us, it's beneath us, breathing. And perhaps that's why, no matter how many times we try to bury these tales, they come back, rising like sap through the orchard trees, waiting for someone willing to remember. And yet, if you're feeling that shiver right now, that subtle weight pressing on your chest, know this: the orchard might be patient, the house might be waiting, but you are still here. Reality still belongs to you, and the salt in the air is just salt unless you choose to believe otherwise. So if ever you find yourself standing on a quiet road, staring east toward trees that lean closer than they should, and if the wind carries a note of lavender and iron, remember one thing above all: not every door deserves to be opened, And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to simply let the orchard rest. Because in the end, some stories don't want to be solved. They just want to be remembered, and that, my friends, is how legends stay alive.